it's my great pleasure today to introduce my buddy, Peter Fallesen. So where would you start when introducing Peter, if charged with this? With the mustache, of course. But beyond just having an incredible mustache, which we should all just acknowledge with shock and horror, depending, or whatever other emotion it provokes in you, and just being an insanely nice guy. Peter also has a lot going on for him professionally. He's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Swedish Institute for Social Research at Stockholm University, and a senior researcher, as of yesterday, by the way, at the Rockwool Foundation Research Unit in Copenhagen, where he is unfortunate enough to work with me for about 20% of my time. So Peter completed his PhD in sociology at the University of Copenhagen in 2015, so he's moving right along through things. Peter's interests are at the intersection of child welfare, family demography, criminology, and quantitative methods, as this talk today indicates, and his research has already started to get published in a bunch of great places, including PLOS ONE, Journal of Health and Social Behavior, and Child Abuse and Neglect. But since our time is relatively short, and I always start late on everything somehow, let's just sort of get things rolling. So welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks to the Bronfenbrenner Center to allow me to give this talk today. I will try to speak into the microphone. So today I'm going to present some work that I'm doing with my friend and colleague Lars Andersen, who's a criminologist at the Rockwool Foundation in Copenhagen. And as Chris said, I'm more in the family area of things, and Lars is more the criminologist. So this joint project was kind of an ideal way for us to work together, where we're going to be looking at alternative to incarceration and how choosing a different type of penal policy can affect life course of offenders. And we're going to be looking specifically at their romantic relationships. And of course, this is all going to be on Danish data, for reasons I will get into in a bit. So you can't really give a talk on criminology in the US without showing some version of this graph. I mean, this is the incarceration rate in the US, and when I started out as a PhD student, this was always a very negative story. But luckily, in recent years, this mass incarceration experiment has kind of slowly started to decline. So since around 2010, the incarceration rate in the US is actually declining. It looks a bit different if we also include local jails, but the overall story is fewer people are starting to get placed fewer people are being incarcerated. And this is kind of what cleared for us referred to as the punishment imperative is kind of weeding off a bit, which opened up for a bunch of discussions about decarceration trends and also about alternative ways to penalize offenders, because there's a bunch of ways why we should be interested in alternatives to incarceration. First of all, incarceration is expensive. I mean, and it's expensive both to run a prison, but it also has a bunch of costs for offenders that ends up also being cost for society. First of all, recidivism. If we look at the research that is already out there on non-custodial alternatives to incarceration, then offenders who end up serving time by some form of electronic monitoring or by community service, restorative justice, all of these types of alternatives, they end up having low recidivism rates. And there's also some experimental evidence on this, basically saying that if you never go to jail, never go to prison, you're less likely to go to prison. This kind of brings on a bunch of secondary effects that's also worth noting. First of all, if you allow people to serve time with an ankle bracelet or do community service, their labor market performance is better post-conviction and also post-serving their time. So this means for society, we get a bunch of extra income in form of taxes, and for the individual, it basically means that you're not losing the human capital as they would be while incarcerated. Secondly, there's also some work in the economics of crime kind of pointing out that when you go to prison, you're not only losing human capital, you're also quite likely to actually build criminal capital. You either get specialized in certain fields of criminality, or you meet people you go on to commit future crime with. So there's a bunch of adverse experiences that also can have positive effects on the labor market that you kind of miss out of when you don't go to prison. Secondly, if you're in the midst of taking education, say you're in high school or some other form of educational program, when you are incarcerated, that activity is very likely to stop. While if you're allowed to serve in some way in your time, some way in the community, you're more likely to continue in these programs. There's some recent work coming out of Denmark on data quite similar to the stuff I'm going to be presenting on that found quite substantial effects on educational retainment if people are allowed to serve with they're specifically looking at GPS monitoring. And the last thing is that when you go to prison, there's a loss of what we might call pro-social contacts. Chris has done some work with a Danish colleague of mine showing that if fathers are allowed to serve time in community service instead of being incarcerated, that children are less likely to end up in foster care. And there's a bunch of more descriptive studies generally finding that incarceration has quite negative effects on marriage market possibilities for offenders, and that's actually what we're going to be looking at specifically today. We're going to look at how being allowed to serve your prison sentence with an ankle bracelet at home instead of being incarcerated is going to affect your likelihood of finding a partner, and if you already have a partner, the likelihood of remaining with that partner after your sentence is done. So basically, there's a bunch of reasons why we should care about this, right? As I said, all the stuff that are likely to keep, we know are likely to keep people out of prison: labor market, attachment, education, marriage, pro-social peers, all that stuff. All those resources are depleted when you go to prison. So basically, the stuff we want people to have so they don't commit crime, they lose those when they go to prison. So as I said, basically, these non-custodial alternatives where people stay in the community can be a way to kind of curtail some of these adverse effects of our penal system. So we're going to be focusing on electronic monitoring in Denmark and how that affects offenders' relationships. Electronic monitoring, or EM for short, works a bit different in the Danish setting than it normally does in the US. So in the US, it's mainly used either as pretrial detention, so as a home confinement for offenders awaiting trial, or it's used as a probationary tool, but mainly not to keep people a certain place, but for example for sexual offenders, not to allow them within a certain amount of feet from schools, and so on. In Denmark, instead, it's used strictly as an alternative to incarceration. So it's something you do instead of going to prison. Secondly, as I kind of hinted to, the US is very much been used as a geographical confinement. Either you're only allowed to be at home, or you're not allowed to be certain places in the community. In the Danish setting, it instead is used as an instrument or technology that makes people adhere to very strict, a reviewer of mine referred to it as militaristic schedules. So the way we implement it in Denmark is that you are given certain time slots where you have to be certain places. So you have to be at home, say from 5 o'clock in the afternoon until 7 in the morning. Then you have a 10-minute time slot to leave home to go to work or education and so on. Have to be there at a certain time. You're only allowed to leave at certain periods. You might have 2 hours a week where you're allowed to go out and do grocery shopping. And if you if you fall out of these 10 minutes windows without having a good reason, like the bus might be late, that would be a simple reason, but if you fall out of these windows, you basically go back to jail or prison. Third difference is that electronic monitoring is generally found to be quite costly in the US. Also, the few experiments where they have been used as an alternative to incarceration are generally found to be quite costly. In the Danish setting, it is 66% cheaper to have someone serve time with GPS monitoring than as incarcerated. And that has something to do with the fact that our prisoner to staff ratio is basically 1-to-1 in prison, so our prisons are also very costly to run and they're not privatized. So the full cost rests with the government. There's a bunch of other requirements in place to be allowed to serve with electronic monitoring. First off, it's something you have to apply for, but you cannot apply for it before after you're convicted and sentenced. And that's a quite important distinction, because this is not an alternative sentence. This is not like community service. This is an alternative way to serve an incarceration. It also means that once you get into the data, we're going to have a very nice experiment on our hands, because everyone in our data is actually sentenced to prison. Some are just allowed to serve it at home. Secondly, if you're residing with anyone, all adults on the same address as you has to give their consent that you're allowed to serve the time at home. So in the case of domestic violence, for example, it's completely fair for the partner to deny the offender the right to serve at home. Secondly, you can only serve GPS monitoring if you are either employed, enrolled in workfare programs, or enrolled in educational program. If you are on public benefits and like disability pensions, you're also allowed to serve at home. But you have, if you're not disabled, you have to be in some kind of gainful activity. So we're also kind of getting into some kind of routine actions that you have to have this, like, you have to have this every day. That's very much like, from a normative standpoint, how society wants you to behave. You have to go to work, you have to go to school, you have to participate in workfare. Also, if you're employed, your employer has to give their consent. You can serve your time with electronic monitoring. So the more pro-social aspects of your community also becomes aware of the fact that you have created an offense, which might cause stigma, but might also cause people to actually give some aid to keeping you on the straight and narrow. You're not allowed to have any incarcerations within the last 2 years of the offense that you're being sentenced for. And during the entire time people are serving, they can, on a moment's notice, be asked to be checked for alcohol and drugs. And if you are in any way intoxicated, you go straight to prison. So this is very militaristic set of policies, and the ankle bracelet in itself is actually merely the technology that kind of allows the prison and probation system to make people adhere to these very strict requirements. And further on, since everyone here is sentenced before they apply, they're serving the same amount of time with the ankle bracelet as they would have served in prison. So a bit about Denmark, those who...
We didn't have any restrictions on a type of crime?
There is a few, but we're going to use it. We'll be using a reform so that only affects people who were sentenced for up to 90 days. But since then, it's been rolled out, so everyone who's sentenced for up to 6 months. But there are certain specific types of offenses that if you're caught with a weapon, you're not allowed to serve with GPS monitoring. But otherwise, it's basically everyone who serves up to 6 months now, and in the data we're using up to 3 months.
And if they break one of the rules, like for instance, if they tested positive for drugs, is their sentence increased? No, they're literally that day transferred to serve the rest of their time in prison. So just to get the context, Denmark is
somewhere between the size of Maryland and West Virginia, with 5.7 million people in it, and an overall incarceration rate of 61 individuals per 100,000, which can be compared to U.S. rates, which is 751 per 100,000. These are, I think, both are 2014 numbers. The average sentence length in Denmark is quite low, so the average person who is incarcerated will serve 8 months, which is, as far as I know, the minimum sentence you get in a federal prison in the U.S. or state prison. So we have quite few people serving time, and the only people serve quite short times, and we have very high staff to inmate ratios. So basically, main question here is, does allowing people to serve their time with electronic monitoring, does that affect their relationship status in a positive way the years following their conviction? And I kind of gave the main problem away. People have to apply for this. And there's a very thorough investigation carried out to see whether or not you're allowed to serve. So the people who get to serve their time with electronic monitoring are not your average offender. So to kind of address this selection issue, we're going to be using a policy change that occurred the 1st July 2008. And from that date on, anyone who had committed a crime and was convicted to up to 90 days and above the age of 25, they were allowed to serve time with an ankle bracelet. They were not allowed to it prior. Prior to this, you had to be younger than 25 to serve time with electronic monitoring. And the take-up rate was quite drastic. So we went from people who committed their crime the 30th of June had zero probability of getting to serve their time with electronic monitoring, while if you had waited 1 day, your probability was around 0.4. So we had a very high take-up rate very fast. And this graph is declining a bit. That's due to we had a higher number of offenders committing crimes around second half of 2010. So the absolute number of people, this is on quarters, the average number of people serving each quarter is pretty much the same. There's just an inflow of differences in the inflow of inmates. So there's basically there's a supply issue. They can't supply enough ankle bracelets.
What prompted that policy change?
It was prompted by the fact that the first policy change that occurred in 2006 aimed at young offenders was generally deemed a success, and the fact that this was a cheaper alternative. And then some of my colleagues did some work on this reform and labor market consequences of it, and that work then resulted in this policy being further on, so you could serve time up if you're sentenced up to 6 months. It was one of the rare occasions where we actually saw, like, politicians listening to criminal justice scholars. So we have this rather drastic change in take-up rate, which is a very it's a kind of graph you want when you want to do causal inference over policies.
I think I missed it. By take-up, you mean actually we're allowed to?
Yeah.
Okay.
So some of these people would break the rules and go back to or go to prison at some point, but this was everyone. These numbers, the probability of at least beginning a sentence with electronic monitoring. It also means that we're going to get a slightly conservative estimate on the actual effect. So the analytical strategy, this is quite simple. So we basically got to compare the relationship trends the 4 years leading up to the year people commit a crime, and then looking at the next 4 years of their lives, on whether or not, we're going to look at it annually, whether or not they're in a relationship. And then we're just going to compare those who committed a crime before the reform with those committed after. So in medical literature, there's basically an intention to treat effect. So we just evaluate in the overall policy, but we can't really speak to the mechanisms. But since there was no take-up prior to the reform, we can also calculate the average effect for those who actually serve time with electronic monitoring. And if anyone in here is an economist, then that's basically just the Wald estimator. Basically, we can just divide the effect we find with the share of people in the population who actually took up treatment when they had the chance to do it. So the data we're using are Danish registry data, and the way I normally describe it is that Denmark, in many ways, is a society envisioned by George Orwell. We more or less know everything. Because you are assigned a social security number at birth or at time of immigration, and you use that number for everything. So we have unemployment, we have individual unemployment levels on a weekly basis, we have employment information on a monthly basis, we have crime down to the daily level, we have education, foster care, welfare benefit take-up, and we also know where you live, because you are by law required to register when you change your address. So we know where everybody, well, we have an indicator of the address where everybody lives, and that's down to the apartment level. So in that data, and last thing, we can also link parents to children and people who are living together. So in that data, we're basically we're going to take everyone between the age of 25 and 59 who committed an offense that would allow them to serve time with electronic monitoring had they committed that offense after the reform was initiated. And we're going to follow everyone who committed these types of crimes between January 1st, 2006 and December 31st, 2009, because the reform was in midway in 2008, and we don't have we haven't gotten the electronic monitoring information from 2010 yet. And then, because we're going to be looking at people's relationship 4 years prior, we're also going to build in that requirement that you cannot have been incarcerated in the 4 years before you commit your present crime. And these unique personal identifiers we get allow us to follow people over time. And the address identifiers allow us to figure out who's living with who. So we're going to be using two different outcome measures that are both are going to be measured January 1st of each given year. We're going to have an outcome that's being in a cohabiting relationship, and that is with you are two individuals of different sex who are sharing a dwelling. You're within 15 years of age of each other, and you're the only two adults beyond one of the two partners' children living on that address. So we could be picking up some flatmates who are two different genders, but we are not going to be picking up people who live a bunch of folks together. But just to make sure that this is not just driven by being that you become a bad flatmate if you either go to prison or get an ankle bracelet, then we're also just going to be looking at people's likelihood of being married, just to kind of add as a robustness check for our results. There's a bunch of new stuff coming out, some of it on European data, some of it on American data, arguing that these two distinctions between cohabitation and marriage are increasingly becoming very hard to, on a theoretical level, to kind of have distinct from each other. So we're just going to be using marriage as kind of a robustness check.
What's the logic behind rejecting people who've been
that was part of the requirement to serve time with electronic monitoring.
Right. Why did they have that requirement? I would think they would want to.
That's actually a good question. I don't know that. My best guess is that they still wanted to a certain extent appear tough on crime. So you would not allow like serial offenders or career criminals to kind of get it easy off. But we wanted to be viewed more as a way to someone who kind of stepped out of line a bit to get a second chance. So the sample we're going to be left with is 4,500 offenders. At the beginning of the year they commit the crime, 1,250 of those are in a relationship, and just above 800 are married the year they commit the crime. And if we look at the pre- and post-reform groups, they are basically identical on relationship rates at the time start of the year they commit the crime. They're the same age, they have the same education, they commit the same types of crimes in the same degree. The only thing that differs a little bit is that one group has slightly better educated fathers, but that's it's at this third decimal difference. It's a very, very small difference, but it is a significant difference between the groups. Otherwise than that, they are quite nicely balanced. So if we look at what this reform actually did, then here we have, on the y-axis, we have the likelihood of being single a given year. And on the x-axis, we have the years relative to committing a criminal act. So at year 0, people commit their crime at some point. And the black circles are the pre-reform group, and the white circles are the post-reform groups. So there's a bit of a difference the years leading up to committing the crime, but none of this difference is luckily significant. But consistently, for 5 years after committing the crime, those who committed the crime after the reform, on average, had substantially lower singlehood rates. We can't and if we limit this to people who were in a relationship the year they committed the crime, this becomes even more clear. So here, at January 1st, the year you commit a crime, everyone is in a relationship. But 5 years out, there is 10% difference, 10 percentage points difference in your risk of being single. So just committing the crime after reform apparently leads to a substantial decrease in the risk of being single. And if we look at marriage, we're basically seeing the same thing. It takes a little longer. This is the likelihood of being divorced now, instead of just likelihood of being single. So everyone here is married at year 0. And the first 2 years, nothing really happens, partly because it takes half a year to get divorced in Denmark. And you also have to apply for the divorce at some point. But the moment we go 3 years out, we're seeing, again, a quite persistent difference between the groups. And when we throw this into a fixed effect difference in difference estimators, you kind of get at some numbers. We find that the reform lowered convicted men's risk of singlehood with 4.5 percentage points. And that's just the raw intention to treat estimate. For men who were single the year they committed the crime, their marriage market possibilities dropped with around 3 percentage points. So you were 3 percentage points less likely to find a new partner in the next 5 years, or be with a new partner, not necessarily. And for people who were in a relationship, their risk of singlehood decreased with 9 percentage points. So we're talking marginal effects well above 15%. If you only look at marriage, the reform increased men's likelihood of being married with around 3 percentage points. For those who were unmarried, the year they committed crime is basically the same, but for those who were married when they committed the crime, they were 4.4 percentage points more likely to remain married the next 5 years. For this group, the men married at the year they commit the crime, we're only getting borderline significant results, but if we break them down by year, so here we're basically just interacting the policy effect with the reforms, we're seeing that until committing the crime, year 0 here, there's no significant difference between the pre- and post-reform group, but then slowly it starts to build. Again, it takes time to divorce. And then for year 3 to year 5, we're seeing constantly significant results that ends up around 12 percentage points. 12 percentage, not percentage points. Because this is basically when we look at, as I said very early on, these are just intention to treat reform results. So it's basically just measuring the effect of the policy. If you instead look at what happened to the people who actually took up electronic monitoring, then we're seeing that we can call this the average electronic monitoring effect for treated. We're seeing that if we look at the relationship outcome, the full sample, taking up electronic monitoring increased your likelihood of being in a relationship the following 5 years with more than 13 percentage points. For those who were in a relationship at year 0, we're talking an increase of 20 percentage points. That's an effect so substantial we spent 2 months trying to destroy it because we found it very high, but it won't go away. And for those who are single, there's still a 10 percentage point difference in your relationship market possibilities. Whereas if we're looking strictly at marriage, we're not seeing those differences. And there's a number of reasons why. First of all, it is a slightly different group that marry. Secondly, also a lot of people cohabit in years leading up to the time of marriage. But we're still seeing substantial effects on marriage. So overall, I mean, there's general agreement that being involved with different types of pro-social institutions are a good way for ex-offenders to begin on a pathway of desistance. And allowing to stay in the community, to stay both both staying with your partner, but also staying at work and getting into these types of routine activities, having to live a normal everyday at a very strict regime at the same time, have substantial impact on people's likelihood of being in a relationship the next 5 years when we compare them to comparable offenders who instead are incarcerated. So if we want to promote desistance, but at the same time also want to promote decarceration trends, then non-custodial alternatives such as electronic monitoring can be a quite viable tool. Thank you.
Besides these main effects, were there subgroup variations? So were the effects stronger, weaker, say, for prior offenders or by offense type or any?
We actually found the strongest effects among violent offenders. But I mean, also these are if you're a violent offender but you commit a crime that only lands you 90 days in jail, it's not the worst type of violence. I think the Danish penal code will call it simple violence. But they are the ones who seems to benefit the most. We also, because everyone here is sentenced before they can apply, we know how long you would have spent incarcerated. And for offenders who are in relationships when they're incarcerated, sentence length doesn't really matter. But for offenders who are single, we're actually seeing that it's mainly those who would have served short sentences that gain, which sounds counterintuitive, but I have a colleague who's done some work on sentence length showing that for offenders who serve short times, it's actually better to serve 2 months than serve 1 month. Because if you're in the system for 2 months, the system actually have a time to adjust to you. You can maybe get that anger management course. If you have substance abuse problems, you can get some treatment. If you're unemployed, you can get some help in getting employment when you get out. So there is, while it seems counterintuitive, there is actually pretty good evidence that supports why we find that. We've also just, again, as I said, we've tried to destroy our results quite a lot because they are quite substantial. So one of the things we've been doing is we're taking the policy period in our data and then we just try to shift it to each side, basically doing what's called pseudo tests and seeing if if the policy effect goes away when we shift the data, which we would like to do. And this is kind of our p-values when we do that. So here's the actual reform, finding nice significant effects, and the moment we move out of it, everything just goes away. So it is, I mean, we have tried to destroy this quite a lot, and it just keeps coming up the way we want it to.
So I imagine there would be a number of benefits for children as well, for the offenders who are either married or cohabiting if there are children involved. Do you or anyone in your research group have data on how this affects parenting or child development, for example, for the offenders who are allowed to wear the monitoring?
We have actually Chris and I have a colleague who are starting her PhD in a couple of months, who are looking into how it affects children's GPA. To have I think she's using community service as far as I remember. And there she's finding effects on GPA. And I mean, Chris has done some work with our colleague Sina, looking into the risk of going to foster care. And here they also find that if you're allowed to serve in the community, over the next, your kids' risk of going to foster care decreases quite substantially over the next 1.5 years. And as late as today, I'm looking into what happens to the criminality of the people who are living with you, be them your younger siblings, or if your parent being your child, or just if you're just sharing a house with other people. And even there, we're actually seeing decreases in crime. So there also seems to be quite large positive externalities of this program.
I guess I'm just, I mean, whatever, we've known each other a while. And we've been through the review process in U.S. journals with Danish data, so this won't annoy you too much. But, like, so it's a lot more expensive relative to incarceration in the States, and so the cost-benefit analysis is going to be quite different. I mean, I guess something I'd like to hear you talk about a little bit more is, so do you have a sense for how high the crime rates are for folks when they're on electronic monitoring, and what sort of the different types of offenses you see? Because if it's mostly sort of, even if the rates are very high, if it's mostly kidly stuff, then it's not such a big deal in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, especially if there are these like positive externalities. But if it's pretty serious stuff, if we're thinking about it getting traction in the U.S., where the actual criminal justice costs would be more comparable, it could be tougher.
True. I mean, these are all.
Here's my question on prisons.
Sure.
Just so, I don't get how it's not adding up. How it can be more expensive to do the home maintenance than paying all of someone's expenses in prison. In the U.S., so I wonder if you could fold in why it could be more expensive.
It's a manpower question. So because you need people to go out and do the substance abuse tests. You need people to be there when the alarm goes off and someone breaks their pattern. So there's a much stricter one-to-one follow-up. You also need to do these personal investigations before people. So there's basically a bunch of work hours that goes into it that's not present when you're just chucking someone into a cell block together with 250 others and 10 guards. So it's very much, actually, it's that margin that's different because we have such a high staff to inmate ratio in Denmark. So I mean, basically these programs have caused cell blocks to be closed. But I think, I think it's important to keep in mind, go back to your question, Chris, that these are not hardened felons. These are people committing the types of crimes. Well, as programs scale out today, the type of crime that lands you 6 months in jail in Denmark. I mean, if you get caught moving a kilo of weed and you have a weapon, you're gonna land around 4.5 years. So these are people from the lower end of the spectrum. So I think in terms of something like, I mean, if you look at the U.S. policy field right now, you're giving clemency to nonviolent drug offenders, and I think especially for that group, this might be a very relevant program. So people being caught with small amounts of narcotics, don't have violent prior, I think that would be a very good group to target with a program like this. Because also you can also actually aid them in any substance abuse issues they have, because you are out there following them up constantly. And I think, for me, I think one key selling point is the whole routine activity aspect. You kind of force people into living a life that society sees as productive. I mean, there are normative aspects in that might be problematic, but I can see it work very well in terms of the system's generally positive social outcomes for offenders.
I'm thinking about that if someone's just in prison and they have substance abuse issues, and that when they get home, they're going to go back to substance abuse. They got to learn how to live a different lifestyle. So this still might help, particularly that population. I don't know if you look specifically at people, but I don't know how if you. I
mean, most of the people who end up going, who are allowed to serve with EM, but ends up going to prison anyway, are people who actually break the substance abuse clause in the program. But there's some anecdotal evidence that's been done some qualitative work on some of these offenders. For them it seems like a lot of that, the whole routine, getting out of the routine you're in when you were using, that seems to carry a lot of weight. And I think one of the interesting findings from the qualitative work on this is from younger offenders. Those of them who have actually been to prison before say it's much harder to serve time with electronic monitoring, because when they're in prison, they're just there and it's a period and you get out. But when you have the ankle bracelet on, it's so evident to you what you're missing, because everything is right out there. It's the same. We have a lot of our prisons are open, so offenders can come and go during the day, but have to be in before curfew and so on. And again, if you talk with people who have been in prison a bunch of times, a lot of them actually prefer to sit in high security prisons, because again, there the wall is right in front of you. It's not just in your head. So I think the fact that this makes the cost of committing crime so much more visible than what you in terms of what you lose in everyday life is a substantial aspect of the effect we find.
I think it's related to the people who kind of broke the rules after and kind of drop out. Do you know anything about their home environment that might, because they're returning to their homes, right? So
yeah.
The offenders have variable home contexts that may make it more difficult to reintegrate or not. And so do you know anything about their systematic?
No, I think a lot of, if we look at when people break the rules, the largest part of them do it within the first couple of days. So they get the ankle bracelet on, they're in their home, and they go out in the fridge and grab a beer. And then 10 minutes later, the prison probation service is at the door by spot check. And I think that is because we can see that if you get through the first week, people remain in the program.
Is there any similar spiking immediately after? In terms of, I guess at that point it wouldn't necessarily be violation, but spiking of actual crimes.
That's a really good question. We haven't looked at that. We should, because we've been talking a lot about looking at whether people actually pick up their act in between committing being caught for the crime and being sentenced, to make them more likable to the system in terms of electronic monitoring. But looking at the other type of Aspenfelder depth could be really interesting.
So have there been some qualitative studies of the impact on, say, marriage or partner quality? Because we were just joking that for some people, I think of men in our culture, this would be the most time they'd ever spent home in their entire lives. And the idea that prison is preferable to that. Have people looked at mechanisms of these positive relationship effects?
I think there is some U.S. stuff on it. and also there's been done. I know there's been done some qualitative work on the stigma of carrying the ankle bracelet as well, but I don't know it very well. But we can discuss that. How much because I do a bunch of work on divorce in general, and also on how people reach the decision to divorce, and it's a lot about social learning. And all of a sudden, here you're cramming this couple together in their house like every day for up to 3 months. But we don't know enough about it yet. But it's something that's also on the list of stuff we'd like to look into down the line. Is that a hint or?
Oh no.
No.
I'm just thinking about how you would. I think we've talked about stuff like this a bunch, but like how you would try something like this in the States, and it seems like the right level would be jail probably rather than prison.
Yeah.
Just because you wouldn't like the level of buy-in you have to have across the state would be smaller. But so you would think like simple violence and simple violence, small amounts of narcotics. I guess I'd just be curious to hear like what sorts of offenses you would target if you were thinking about rolling out a plan like this, keeping in mind that in the States we have like no supports for people, which is relevant for something like this.
Yeah,
and then
true.
also in an area like this where it's not Copenhagen, like I would just be interested to hear a little bit about the like staffing. Like how does the staffing differ in Copenhagen relative to the rest of Denmark, if you know? Because I guess I would expect that you need a larger staff to electronic monitoring in ratio outside of Denmark.
Yeah, but I mean the good thing about the ankle bracelet and the very strict time schedule is that you know where people are going to be.
Yeah.
So you can actually, the spot checks will appear random for the offender, but they can be planned quite a long time in advance. So I think the staff ratios outside metropolitan areas aren't actually that different.
Yeah.
For that very simple reason.
Yeah.
But to kind of tie back into the U.S. concept, I think, the county level jail, getting it. This again, we're talking a very small country, right? We're a bit less than 6 million people. This is not something I can see roll out on a national scale in the U.S., but on a state or county level, I would perceive it to be quite manageable, and you could reinforce the whole community aspect of it as well. But for state or federal prisons, I have a harder time seeing it work, at least in the short term.
Maybe the nature of the crime weighs into the answer of this, that it's on the lower spectrum in terms of offenses. But do you have data on rates of recidivism for those who actually go to prison and those who wear the monitoring?
Yeah, the Danish Ministry of Justice, their research units have done some work on it, and there I think the recidivism rate decreases with around, I think it's around 15% for those who serve time with electronic monitoring. But I think it's not. I think some of it is actually the fact that you become so aware of what you're missing out on. But some of it is also definitely the fact that the rest of your life don't fall apart.
So you're 15% less likely to reoffend.
Yeah.
I wanted to clarify something first, and then I had a question. So there were variances in how long, the sentences were with the ankle monitor.
Yep.
And I was wondering, did you see any differences? As you mentioned, people that were in prison longer actually reaped some benefits by having more time. Did you find that those with longer sentences with the ankle monitoring were doing better than those with just a short time, because they had additional time to get into the routine? Were they better off than those with shorter?
For the groups who were in relationships when they when they committed their offense. We don't see a difference across length there. We did see that difference for those who were single. But also, I mean, it's true, if you're in being in a relationship when you commit a crime and being single, it becomes two very different marriage market stories, right? Because for the groups who are in relationships, it's probably about proximity and like physical closeness, and there's a bunch of stuff being done on incarceration, and relationships point to the fact that people kind of grow apart. And even rather short whiles can actually make people grow apart and change a bit, so it becomes hard to kind of readjust to each other once you come back. Whereas I think for those who are single when they commit their crime, it's very much about being eligible on the marriage market. And that thing, I mean, I'm halfway a sociologist, halfway an economist. For me, that kind of always falls back to earnings potential. And we know that these kinds of programs gave people better labor market attachments, so that they become better, at least in that way of considered better partners. And I think with the fact that they also tend to desist more, also plays a key role. There's just a bunch of stuff there's a bunch of secondary effects that kind of tickle out that together, I think, form these differences.
Any difference between men and women prisoners?
These are all men, because the very blunt way of saying it, women don't commit crime, right? But I mean, in this data we had 10-15% of the offenders were women. And I mean, no matter what we do, again, we are a small country, so we can't really, I mean, we can never pick anything up on them. And also, I mean, if you look at it long term, at age 45, more than a third of all Danish men would have committed at least one non-traffic related offense. But for women, that number is down around 6 or 7. So it's just, it would be fun to put them into the model and see what happens, but it's just such a small group that. And I think, I mean, it's also, in terms of gender roles and gender equity, it's a specific part of society that tends to commit crime. So I would have a harder time kind of laying out some of the mechanisms for women than I would for men.
I'm wondering a little bit about the motivation. You said they are open prisons, so they don't have to go to prison usually during the day, just at nighttime, right?
Yeah, but the open prisons are not often not where you live. So you are free to kind of go down to the local town, a village, and shop groceries and stuff like that. Because basically all inmates in all Danish prisons tend to make their own food. Chris and I went to a Danish prison last year, and like we walked into a cell block, and there was knives hanging on the wall, and he just went pale.
Stella really went pale.
But it's more that some of them are actually also allowed to take up work at the end of their sentence, but we quite often use the open prisons as the final stage before you leave if you have had a lengthy sentence, because there's not really a reason to chuck someone in open prison for 2 months. Transitional thing, yeah, because we don't use halfway houses and stuff like that, but we can use this as a way of transitioning.
Did you look at differences for the people who were married, like whether children, presence of children in the household at the crime committed?
No, we actually haven't looked at that. I think it's.
Oh, right. Okay. So you have a number of adults.
Yeah. I would actually have children.
Number of children.
Yeah, but I think my main concern is that we're already slicing the data quite thin. So if we start slicing on that as well, it becomes very small. That's, I think, some of the stuff being done in community service is better there because you have a larger group of people. Also, as you can actually be sentenced to community service for a lot longer sentences than you can for electronic monitoring, but for more specific types of crimes as well. But there's some work. Chris has done some of it, and some of our colleagues have done other, looking at children specific.
Maybe one final question. No final questions. Well, thank you so much for coming.